I'm going to ask Nick to introduce himself, as he's going to, I suspect, give us a whole new way of looking at things this morning or afternoon. So, all over to you, Nick, please.
Thanks very much, Graham. I'm just going to try and share my PowerPoint. And I've not put too much into this, so it's quite a sort of a collection of bits and pieces I've pulled from other places, but it's really just to sort of start a bit of a conversation. So my understanding, Graham, is you sort of normally go for about sort of 20 minutes and then ask for a discussion and debate. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yep.
Brilliant.
People are feel free to go short on that or long on that. It doesn't matter
Okay.
much. And the questions and answers also go short on. So
Right.
vary.
Okay. Well, I was invited along partly by Linda, so it's lovely to see you as well, Linda, and you might sort of recognise bits and pieces of this, but I thought I'd start off with a bit of an introduction because I'm conscious that, like many of you, I've probably wear different hats. This is my Climate Psychology Alliance board member hat, which I wear from time to time, but I'm going to sort of explain a little bit more about some of the other hats I wear, and also because for me the sort of the point of collaboration is to work across different organizations and different perspectives. So let me move that forward. So a really important question for me, and I think we're all seeing what's going on in the news, and just this sense of you know, from my perspective, just real sort of shock and dread really at what's happening in the world. So this question about what is my work to do at this time, which sort of feels like a bit of an ongoing quest for people, really sort of feels particularly relevant at this moment in time this week. But like many of you, I've been on a bit of a journey with this, so I'm sort of got the benefit of moving through different perspectives on the climate crisis from a sort of rather optimistic way of thinking that, oh yes, if we can just reduce our carbon footprints, then things will be better, through to sort of, well, we've got all the technology, so why can't we just put it all in place, through to sort of having to think more widely about, well, how does society need to change, through thinking, well, actually, we've left all this far too late, so we're sort of at that point of thinking about collapse more now. And I'm sure, like others, I've been along this sort of journey of starting to sort of become more facing the reality of where we are. Um, I've shared this with a few people in the past, and I find it quite a useful way to understand where people actually are on that journey, as a way to sort of start to have conversations with people who might be having different viewpoints, just about how far down that line they are of thinking things have really gone past the point where we can expect to mitigate some of these worst effects of collapse. And like others, I've sort of moved into increasingly pushing for adaptation at the community scale. So that for me is, I've found this quite a useful way to sort of just understand where people are on their own journey. This is something that was produced by Kim Hare at the Heart Community Group. They're quite happy for people to use that. I wanted to explain a little bit more about me and and the various hats bit as well. So I am, as I said, a board member of the Climate Psychology Alliance. Um, I'm also an advisor to the Climate Majorities Project SAFER campaign, which stands for Strategic Adaptation for Emergency Resilience. And I'm still doing some work with the Transition Town network in the UK, especially in Wales and England, through their project Transition Together and what's coming out of that. And I spent 3 years working with Communities Prepared. I believe you've had somebody from Communities Prepared speaking to this group in the past as well. So hopefully that will sort of not need me to go into too much detail. But really what I've been sort of trying to understand myself in that, what is my work to do at this time, is what's the right scale to focus your efforts on. There's things that you need to do at a local community scale, and there's things there where I've tried to found a local transition town, Planet Heswall, and doing things at the Wirral scale, where there's a Wirral council led, but not sort of exclusively Wirral Council, climate partnership, which involves a lot of different organisations and different sectors, through to things at the city region scale, and there's a sort of increased agenda there with devolution and local government reorganisation, thinking about, well, what is the role of that sort of middle tier between the sort of local councils and the UK government, but also things at the Northwest region scale as well. So I spent some time working at what at the time was called the Local Energy Northwest Hub, but is now one of the net zero hubs, looking at renewable energy projects. So I've over the last sort of 8 or 9 years sort of worked at different scales and spent some time trying to understand where I could have most impact in terms of what changes we can make to our system to prepare ourselves better and to reduce emissions as well. And it's actually felt to me that a lot of the importance is actually working between the scales. So how you manage to get those link ups between those different parts of the system, so that we're working up and down that sort of nested system. Another important part of what I've learned from this, one of the roles on the previous slide was I was the coordinator for the Liverpool City Region's Year of the Environment in 2019. And this picture is from the launch event where Steve Rotherham, the Metro Mayor, is launching the Year of Environment with a group of a mixture of local council leaders and local people from different organisations such as the Recycling and Waste Authority, various Environment Agency colleagues, and faith and voluntary sector people as well in the room there. But a thing that keeps cropping up in my work in this space is actually, how do we make decisions together, and how do we decide who's making those decisions? I guess where you've got an elected Metro Mayor, there's a clear point of authority. But as you start to do work in community settings, it becomes more and more difficult to work out how are we actually making decisions? What's the process by which we make decisions? And certainly something that I found in working in that sort of city region scale, multi-stakeholder campaign really for a year was this thing of, here we're going to need a bigger room, because as you sort of increase the engagement with people, the sort of traditional, oh, let's all get together in a room, you start to hit the limits of room size and room bookings. And this room was the council chamber in the Combined Authority building in Liverpool. And as you can see, that was pretty full. And just trying to get agreements across different cultures, different organisations becomes increasingly difficult in collaborating this space. So something that I spent some time a year or so ago looking into and then trying to implement was sociocracy. I don't know if you've had anybody talking at these sessions about sociocracy, but it's certainly something that I have tried in my work in the transition town movement to try and implement, and in other places as well. So, for example, within the Climate Psychology Alliance, some of the processes we're looking at are sort of more sociocratic, and we're trying to work out how we do some of this stuff. But I thought, just to give a sort of brief overview, this is a slide from Sociocracy for All, and it's really just trying to give this sense of the key attributes of this sort of sociocratic system. So the main thing is that it's based around circles. So you've got sort of small working groups who are working together, and those circles are linked through people who are the sort of connecting people to help the information to flow. It's a different way of making decisions in terms of people give their consent to a proposal that's being put forward into a circle, rather than having to have either a sort of majority vote or some kind of complete agreement. So there's a sort of sense of, if nobody objects, and if somebody does object, then the proposal is changed to try and find a position that everybody can agree with, and that improves the proposal going forward. But the idea, as the slide says, is to decentralize power so that actually the people who are making the decisions are the people who are implementing them. And it's not without its challenges to try and work out a system like that. But that important question about who is making decisions is something that, especially when I've worked in collaborative settings, it keeps coming up again and again, and where are decisions being made. Another part of that sociocracy thing is actually about how we interact with each other as well. So within Sociocracy for All, they talk about non-violent communications as a really important sort of bedrock, really, to help people to empathize better with each other and understand where each other are coming from. And non-violent communications is something that was developed by Marshall Rosenberg. There's a nice book there, but it's quite a basic thing, really, which is that we need to listen to each other, and we need to sort of to speak as well. But the idea of non-violent communications is there's a bit of a pattern to the way that we both listen and speak. So there's a sort of, this is called a cheat sheet, but it's really just the sort of the pattern that you tend to use. So you'd start with an observation, and so when something happens, I feel upset or annoyed or angry or whatever, because I have a need for sort of recognition or understanding. So would it be possible for you to, and then make a request about how you would like the person to sort of to interact with you. And as an approach, it starts to get people to sort of to hear each other more fully. I think it's probably the best way of saying it. So it feels like it's quite, it feels like it's quite an important aspect of collaboration, is actually how we bring our whole selves to the interactions, and how we can both listen and speak empathically and really understand what's going on for somebody, what the feelings that are involved in some of these things, and what are their basic needs behind it. And I also wanted to just, and I suspect that Linda or others might have touched on active hope in the past, but especially given what's going on in the world at the moment, it really feels important to just focus in on some of the inner dimension of what's happening in the climate crisis, and that's part of the work that I've done with Linda and others in the Climate Psychology Alliance. But just Joanna Macy, who many of you hopefully are aware of, who passed away last summer, but has spent many years working in this space. And her quote there about "this is a dark time, filled with suffering and uncertainty, like living cells in a larger body. It is natural we feel the trauma of our world. So don't be afraid of the anguish you feel, or the anger or fear, because these responses arise from the depth of your caring and the truth of your interconnectedness with all beings." And I just think that there's something deeply important and deeply human about that aspect of the climate crisis, and that's why I spend time with the Climate Psychology Alliance and others. And one of the things that that certainly I've been involved in is with both the work that reconnects and Active Hope, which is quite a nice handbook for people who want to go through those processes of responding in a more sort of whole way in terms of the system that we're in. So being able to transform feelings of despair into empowered action. And I think as people understand the situation we're in, that becomes more and more important. I won't go into any more of that, but I'm sure we can talk about that in the questions a bit later. I wanted to talk, following on from that, just briefly about ICRA, which is a new project that the Climate Psychology Alliance, along with the Climate Majority Project and the Mindfulness Initiative, have got funded through the National Lottery's Community Action Climate Action Fund. And the reason I wanted to sort of make you aware of this is because of the collaborative nature of it. So it's a partnership, it's a new partnership, it's three organisations coming together, trying to find ways to engage with communities, both to create a community of practice around people who are doing some of that inner work practice, but also to engage with local communities where there is a need for that as well. And that feels like, from the perspective of the Climate Psychology Alliance and the other partners, it's a really sort of exciting moment, because I think this is the first time that we've seen funding being put into this project at this kind of scale. So this is £1.5 million over 5 years. So it gives some sort of sense of the start of really building up some capacity across the UK in this area. And those are the partners of the Inner Climate Response Alliance, which I mentioned before. Sorry, there's a lot of acronyms in this space, and I'm conscious that they won't all be familiar to people, but I just sort of felt that it's quite an exciting moment for us in CPA. Right. So I wanted to just come back to that scale question that I sort of posed at the start, really, because what's been going on for me is, although I've done previous roles which are sort of grayed out in on that sort of egg diagram, and it looks like there's a lot going on at the UK scale, what I'm increasingly finding is the need to work much more at the local community scale. So just on Monday, I was in a meeting of the Wirral Climate Partnership, called Wirral, looking at what we're going to do over the next 12 months, and increasingly sort of trying to work out how adaptation features into that. But part of this is also this sort of raising awareness of things like the National Emergency Briefing, which hopefully people have heard about, but the need to try and raise awareness across the UK of the state of the climate situation and what we need to do. So I'm spending time in my local community, helping to think about how we organise a screening and how we engage people in the local community in that space. And that feels, for me, like where my focus is moving to at the moment, because it just feels that there's such a strong need to build that local community resilience. That's what I'm seeing. Last week I was at a conference in Manchester, which was looking at societal resilience, whole of society resilience, and just some of the potential risks that we're facing around water shortages and droughts and heat waves and so on. It just sort of feels we've really got to spend the time getting to know our neighbours, building that local set of connections and resilience. And yeah, that's kind of where I'm increasingly moving towards, although I've still got those sort of UK scale roles and responsibilities. So it's sort of trying to juggle those bits and pieces. So that was the end of what I put together as slides, because I wanted to just sort of give you that quick run through and then stop for questions, really, and have some discussion around it.
Thank you very much, Nick. I'm still pondering a few questions which you've triggered thoughts in my head, but the one I was really keen on was how effective do you find the transition towns at getting people to agree more on things like climate change? So I note that there are something like 70 odd transition towns or groups 250 odd in the UK. Which is out of a total of something like 1,200 towns, there's a way to go. But on the other hand, it's a pretty substantial lot to get moving. So are you growing the transition towns and groups? And if so, how effective are they at getting climate change into the order of battle, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a great question, Graham, and it's one that I've struggled with over a number of years, to be fair, because I to sort of give a bit more background on that. When I moved to the Wirral about 10 years ago, there was a transition town that was happening in West Kirby. So I went along and got involved in what they were doing. And what I've learned from that, because then I went and spoke to sort of 7 or 8 different transition towns that were in the northwest area where I live, and found that they were all very different. And they were all kind of driven by people's individual passions and skills and what they wanted to see happening in their community. Sometimes it was strongly based around the community need, and other times it was sort of, I would really love to do, I don't know, a solar project. And so that's what our transition town will put a lot of focus into. So because it's a grassroots movement, all the transition towns are all quite different.
Mm.
And part of the difficulty and why the sociocracy thing is quite important is that how you make collective decisions when there isn't a sort of hierarchy and a top down, this is the direction we're going in, sort of leader type person, becomes quite difficult. And I think what tends to happen is that different individuals in a community will get very passionate about a particular topic, and it might be litter picking, or it might be, I don't know, art installations, or it might be whatever that sort of really takes their focus. So in terms of the actual how strong a response it is as a sort of climate, especially in terms of emissions reductions, is it feels quite weak, to be fair. But what a lot of it is trying to do is to build that sort of stronger sense of community connection, which I think does help in terms of building resilience going forward. So people spend more time doing projects. To some extent, it's slightly immaterial what the project is, provided they are learning how to work together and to um, effectively work on a common task that they've agreed. Because I think that's repurposable to do different things as the situation changes. But yeah, it does feel that what happened with the Transition Together project, which did have some lottery money, and it came to an end after about 3 years, and the transition folk felt that they'd got longer to put in place some of these structures. They thought they were going to have 10 years of funding, but then it stopped after 3 years. So there was a sort of sense of, okay, now we've got to move this out of a small number of paid staff into much more volunteer space, which means that obviously things happen at a slower pace, and probably with a little bit more, uh, you know, discussion around what should the right direction be, and crucially, how do we engage those other sort of 200 or so transition towns that are out there? It comes back to this sort of representation and decision making kind of questions that feel at the heart of building a collaborative grassroots movement.
Yeah, the point of my question really was that the great collaboration is doing its best to get everybody to pull together in roughly the same direction. And I'm just intrigued to know what experiences have been encountered elsewhere so that we can avoid making the same mistakes. And I think by the same token, since we're really just trying to point people in a direction that could be helpful to them, we may well avoid the battles. And certainly the idea of them becoming very political is a real danger sign from my point of view. But anyway, I think Jane has got a question, so we'll pass it on to her, please.
Hello there. Yes. Hi, everybody. This is my first Banter meeting, and I'm a new parish councillor in Milton Keynes, but I've been active, a bit like Nick, in many groups, so in Milton Keynes over the last few years. Um, I'm also in a transition town in Milton Keynes. I joined them 2019, and I think they've been going for over 10 years. But they rely on a very small group of dedicated people People come and go over the years, but we're on an upward curve at the moment. We've also got a climate action network that's formed in Milton Keynes, which I'm part of the committee on. And it's really hard to get organisations to come and join that network. But the ones we've got about 19 so far, varying from climate cafes, repair cafes. Um, so, really trying to bring together people and get those good news stories out. Um, I've also been involved in a donut economics group for a few years. I don't know if you've done anything like that, Nick, and others. And I found that really useful as a way of talking to different sectors. So we've got, you can take that talk to the local government officers or the councillors, but also to people at grassroots. And it's something, people thriving within the planetary boundaries is a very simple concept. So yeah, just to say, yeah, I think transitions are doing well, but I think there's a really real need to engage youth, and especially with this global situation happening. Um, I come from a university background. I was an administrator, took redundancy about 3 years ago. But the problem working with young people is the ethics, barriers to the ethics, and I worry that those people aren't receiving the youngsters aren't receiving the help or the way to engage positively because of these barriers we have in that, obviously you have to safeguard and be so careful working with young people, but there needs to be more, more done to sort of try and engage them. And the youth councils is a way of doing that potentially. So I don't know if any of you have had any ideas about that. So just throw that out there.
I'll just respond briefly, James. I think I'll also be really interested to hear other perspectives. So, on transition towns and youth, that was something that it felt had been somewhat lacking in some areas, across the country. I'm sure there were certain transition towns that had engaged with young people quite strongly, but it was one of the areas that, when there was lottery money for that project that finished a year or so ago, a youth caucus was sort of called to bring the voices of youth, and as a result of that, there is a youth group that is sort of at the center of trying to determine what the future direction is for transition movement in Wales and England. So there's that sort of sense of they're involved right at the heart of the decision making. They're doing their own set of projects, including a film, which is excellent. I've seen a screening of their film, which is trying to explain what it's like to be a young person in today's environment. So this sort of sense of a lack of certainty. What kind of career do I want to do? What should I go to uni? What should I do with my time? Some of the difficult decisions and the future that's facing young people. And that I found was really powerful. And they're starting to do screenings of that and then following it up with a kind of active hope type exercise in community settings. And that it's sort of going to move around slowly. I'm not sure what the name of the film is. I need to find out when they're going to actually make it more widely available, but it's a lovely little film.
Mm.
With my Climate Psychology Alliance hat on, we've got quite a bit of work going on in youth space there. The ICRA partnership is especially brought on some people who will be working with young people. Thank you, Linda. And yeah, it feels that there's a real sense of how we engage young people with things like a youth forum, youth support services and youth circles, those kind of constructs. Also work with parent circles. Within the Climate Majority Project, there's work looking at how to support teachers, who then in turn have to support young people. So there's an excellent film that was put out about a month or so ago, which just sort of gives you the kind of sense of what it's like to be a teacher trying to teach kids who are all on their phones, and what is my future going to look like. And I'll dig that out as well after I've stopped talking and try and find a link there, because that's quite a powerful and moving film. So it feels that, yeah, the youth aspect is getting more attention at the moment than it did, I think, a few years ago. For me, it's more a question of intergenerational discussions and how we can support people working through these things. So one of the things that emerged from that transition film screening and a discussion that we had, thank you, Linda. Um, one of the things that emerged from that was this sort of desire from the young people to have some intergenerational mentoring. So people who've had experiences, they'd really like to hear about, well, what was it like to work in a local authority or a town council, or doing renewable energy projects, or whatever the things are that people have been doing, and how do ourselves, with these experiences that we've had looking at our screens, it looks like we've all got quite a bit of experience, and quite a lot of lived experience. So how can they tap into that? How can they engage that world of experience and that richness, that could help them to make sense of what they do going forward as well. So I think that's a really important aspect, this sort of intergenerational dimension, and mentoring feels like it's missing at the moment, and that they're asking for it.
Thanks, Nick. I must remember that diplomatic line. You've got plenty of lived-in experience. I love that one. I did actually have a question, please, for Jane, which is if you could expand a little bit on the ethical issues that you find raised with the younger generation. I find that from my limited exposure to the younger generation, they are remarkable in how they are, I would say, much better living than we used to be. There's a lot less beer and drinking and alcohol, and a lot less everything else that goes on. And they seem to be very determined to save the planet much more than we were at our age or their age. And so I just wondered what the ethical issues are that you're finding that they're raising.
Um, I think the ethical issues are the extreme safeguarding that academics have to do, and of course academics need to go to their ethics committee and get ethical approval. And I think the bar for working with young people is higher, so sometimes I think they may avoid going to that group of people. So we're not necessarily engaging as much. It's good to hear that there are these initiatives going on, but certainly I've spoken to a few young people, and they're really worried about what's happening in the world. Well,
Mm.
what support are they able to get? And if they're resorting to social media, it's very worrying. So we haven't got anything immediate or agile, in our neighbourhoods to support those parents and the young people and teachers. And similarly, it will be the same with the climate adaptation and resilience. Um, but I've just posted up a project that I have been engaged with recently in Milton Keynes that the Open University are doing with some young students, where they took 20 young students and they've been working with them to talk about environmental careers. It's the beyond their schooling. So yes, there are some really good things happening, but I'm just worried that they're not scaled enough, or available enough. And we very much are in danger of being in, little group thinks of certain, like you say, the generational knowledge that we have. How do we get that dialogue going? Um, we have lots of things like, tree planting things, but there's so many competing events and things going on, yet there's a lack of investment in the youth, in youth activities that are structured in our neighbourhoods. It's a sort of perfect storm, isn't it, really?
Could we move on to David, please?
Right. Yeah. I was thinking back a few years when we had school strike marches every Friday in Oxford, mass march mobilisation by Friends of the Earth, Green councillors forcing the council to have a climate assembly, to have not just declarations but plans from that. And since then, it seems the movements have split up and people have retreated, and all the stuff about working personally and locally logically should be a follow-up to the climate assemblies, but it turns out in practice to be more of a retreat and partially giving up, and I can't do the big things, so let's try doing some small things. Now, that's my perspective in Oxford. I don't know how true that is everywhere, but it does feel very much like a movement that's broken up and a retreat.
I suspect you're directing your question really to Nick, are you?
Well, firstly to Nick, because there's a bit about the scale he was talking about and how you do things at a scale that will have an impact, and what that should be, and how people can come together to do things at the scale that has an impact.
Thank you, David. I think it's a live question for me as well. I think there's it felt in 2019, when all those climate emergency declarations were coming out and Exile were on the streets and everything else, it did feel that we were sort of turning a bit of a corner. And then personally, it felt that COVID sort of really dampened everything down in terms of that amount of energy. And then we've had, obviously restrictions, legal restrictions in terms of gathering and protests and so on. So part of it is that it's a less, I wouldn't say friendly, but the environment just isn't quite so compatible with people making those kind of large-scale demonstrations. I went along to the Climate Coalition's demonstration in Parliament, the mass lobby in the summer. And they explained that because of parliamentary restrictions and safeguarding of MPs, there was much more strict than it had been when they previously had more people involved in those mass lobbies. So there's a sense of the ability to gather people feels a bit hampered. I think also people are probably somewhat disappointed that more hasn't happened. I think you keep hearing that people want politicians to do more, and then they're not acting. And 89% of people, are concerned about the climate crisis, but it doesn't translate into action. And that's where the Climate Majority Project has been trying to mobilise that sort of that set of people that are concerned but perhaps aren't taking action. I think for me, one of the things, and I've come off a call from the National Emergency Briefing people earlier today, and I think one of the things there that feels quite important is to use this moment. And for those who aren't aware, this was an event that was held in November in central London, with the aim of getting as many MPs as possible to hear from subject matter experts on the state of where we are, the climate, and more widely, biodiversity, food security, energy, and so on. And with the next phase of that, and I'm sure Linda can expand on this, to roll this out as a sort of set of community screenings across the UK, again to try and get people to call for this action to happen through getting their MPs involved, to wanting to have a televised national screening of this, so that it's sort of much more on everybody's agenda again, as it was back in 2019. So yeah, it feels that there's a sort of exhaustion that can set in if you've been doing this for a long time as well. So there's also this sort of sense of well, somebody else is picking up the baton and trying a different approach to try and get this to really land. So I'm very grateful to the National Emergency Briefing folk, but there's other things like the Safer campaign, which is also trying to work at how do we both lobby nationally, but also engage people locally in terms of making their communities more resilient to what's coming.
Yes, the biggest event I was at recently was in Leavensholm in Gorton and Denton by-election. So there the approach is don't try and get your MP involved, change your MP.
Ken, can we go with you, please?
I was going to say it worked in Gorton and Denton, didn't it, David? I agree with you that it does feel like we've retreated a bit in view of the many years that so many people have put into it and the relatively little progress we seem to have made. It's very disheartening. However, I feel there is another corner being turned. Nick has just commented on it, the National Emergency Briefing, which I think only about a third of MPs turned up for it. They're not sure what the number was. But either way, they're rolling out a film of it now to try and get more people to actually see it, because it's a massive wake-up call. I don't know if anybody's seen it, but it's a huge slap in the face. It says, come on, wake up. We can't wait any longer to deal with this. So, parish councillor, I've got my parish council to agree to hold a showing in our village hall, and I'll be engaging with local parish councils and see if some of them will either join us or do their own thing. So, and I'm a team of people working in North Dorset, South Dorset, trying to get showings of this going. I was in a meeting yesterday with Jamie from 0 Hour, Graham, and I asked him, would you be prepared to talk to the Great Collaboration Group? And he said, absolutely. So if you want to make a note of his email,
Yep.
It's very simple. It's campaign at 0 Hour, all one word, .co.uk.
Thank you so much.
His name is Jamie, and he'd be perfectly happy to come along and have a chat.
Right.
Okay.
I will be free next Wednesday.
Well, you can try. You can only ask, can't you?
Absolutely. Sue, how are you doing today?
Oh, well, okay. Lots of different thoughts hearing today, the comments. First of all, I wanted to point out there's a podcast called Outrage and Optimism, climate podcast, and the episode from 6 days ago was Catastrophe Apathy, Why the Understanding the Climate Crisis Isn't Enough. And a lot of the debate was about carbon footprints and individual action and national action and lack of, etc. So I want to highlight that it's hard to keep up with everything, and really good you mentioned the National Emergency Briefing and the film showing. And so you come back to each of us doing what we can, some resistant for longer periods than others. I've kept going on. And so as a town council, you can go back to the local activity and where you can see we can get people together, working together, etc., as much as you can. But it feels very uphill, people not wanting to be inconvenienced at all about climate and what it means to them and what they could do. And we're really stuck between lack of action nationally, like, I don't know, good old banning flights that you can do the train journey in 3 hours or less, or whatever, and the government are not doing any of those. It feels like not doing any of those things that really help make people make good choices. So I feel we are really stuck. This session has helped me to think more clearly about adaptation. And within my community, are we doing enough? What else could we do? And so I need to probably look back and see if we had a session on adaptation in the Great Collaboration that I could have a watch of, because I don't feel that I'm up to speed with what we could do in our community. So a bit of garbled thoughts, but I can't believe that I'm the only one who thinks some of those things. Yeah.
Okay, Sue, thank you. I've just put a link to the Optimism and Outrage podcasts so that you can go and look up whichever one you want to look at. But I think the one you were mentioning earlier was Sue was on the back in February.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
with Justin
So
March.
that's there for people to look at. I had an announcement and a question to ask. So the announcement is that the National Emergency Briefing have got a link out that lets you look at the videos from the session itself and their selected parts of their sessions. And then there's a form that they invite you to fill in so that you can actually show the movie which they're creating, which is coming out on the 7th of April, to your local commune. So I'm just writing the page in the knowledge base at the moment, which will be up for everyone to see in an hour or three. And then you can sort of use that to get hold of the link that will make sure that you get a copy of the video, which you can show in your village hall. And they're also looking for people to spread the word across a network. So I'll be doing it on behalf of the Great Collaboration. But if you know others near you, if you're linked to other parishes or whatever, then by all means get them to get the video as well, because I agree, it's a fantastic document. And my question was really for Nick, which was, we seem to get these things that create passion over the years. So if you go back a bit, there was an inconvenient truth, which people really got hold of and said, okay, we need to do something about this. And then, as everyone is saying, it seems that things die. And at the moment, you've got Channel 4's Dirty Business, which is on the water companies and how revolting they've been. And then you've got the NEB. And I just wonder, do you feel that there's any permanency in these outrages that get people moving? Because, we're talking about Friends of the Earth dying down and the Green Movement dying down, but then they'll all get re-energized by some later scandal. That appears to be the human condition. We can't retain the information without being scandalized every now and again. Are you finding that?
Briefly, yes, Graham. I think that does feel like, as you say, it's part of the human condition. I think that we sort of go along quite happily, and then something will jolt us into a different sort of state of awareness or consciousness, and then we'll become very passionate about it for a certain length of time, and then discover that actually we don't have any quick fixes to some of these problems, and so it's who's got the staying power to stay on there in the long term. And I think what's starting to happen is that it's becoming very political now, because I think it's gone past the point where you can sort of say, oh, this is just a natural thing, or this is going to happen, centuries to come, or whatever, because we had a great deal of drought last year. We're having an increase in the number of storms. We're seeing the impacts of climate change starting to bite, and this is just with us being at sort of around 1.5 degrees. We also know that we're storing up all these issues for the future. So I think as the climate impacts start to hit in the UK more, and people start to understand this is a problem that's going to affect our lives. And I remember being at a talk in Chester and saying, look, I used to think this was something for sort of grandchildren type generations. And I think, no, it's actually going to be, in my lifetime, it's going to be effectively the thing that will finish me off. And I think what we've seen in the last week or so, it was actually on the ITV News, the Joint Intelligence Committee report around, which I think was authored by DEFRA, but there was some other input from intelligence agencies as well, around the ecosystem collapse possibilities within the next sort of 5 to 10 year time frame, and what some of the scenarios might be in that space. And I think the more that you sort of uncover what what are some of the risks and what's being said out there, the more worried you can get as an individual, and the more frustrating it can feel that there isn't a bigger conversation going on about this. So there's a sense of, at some point, I think that the dam will break and there will be a kind of a wider societal conversation, and I'm just hopeful that the NEB will start to do that, because it feels that 5 or 10 years ago we didn't have quite the same understanding of how dire the situation was and how close in sort of terms of impacts these things are to us.
Right. Greta Thunberg to the fore. Linda.
Hi, this has been such a rich conversation. A couple of things have come to mind, and a very direct question for Nick. But first, a sort of couple of reflections. The Climate Psychology Alliance spends its time and energy thinking about this very question about the systems that entangle us and entrap us. And if you mention climate psychology to a sort of layperson, that's they're going to say, what do you mean, getting people to put their waste in the right colour bins and how to get the right height and the happy faces. But climate psychology is much more around understanding the responses that we have and the systems we've created that stop us engaging. So I would say there's a lot that can be learnt about how we do engage people by just looking at the Climate Psychology Alliance's webpage. We've got a free guide called the Climate Psychology Alliance Handbook. I've done a few talks for here. For anybody that's new here, they'll be in under the climate psychology thing. And I did a talk just a couple of weeks ago for the Climate Emergency Centres Network, which was a nearly an hour on climate psychology, which you just go into you probably know the CEC, and look that one up. The other thing to say, just as something that's in the working, I'm working with the NEB core team on helping them to think about how they land the film, because we know from so many years of mistakes that just giving people the facts does not move, and what it does is either shut people down or retrench them further into denial or pushing away and using all sorts of psychological defense processes. So if anyone's thinking about hosting a screening, I would encourage you, and I'm just developing a framework right now. It's going to go live from the NEB team in a few days probably, and with Mike Berners-Lee, we're looking at what are the conditions that make it possible for people to absorb and act on information. And what we've been focusing on for years is, what do we need to tell people to get them to act? But if we switched it to, what are the conditions that we need to create care for people so that they know that this is somewhere they can come with their worries and that they can share their fears, and this is a community that cares and isn't frightened of showing it. And I don't mean to say that everyone's weeping, but if we ignore the psychological and emotional, continue to do that, we'll have the same impact. It'll just go out there and we'll just give people a bunch of stuff and they'll go, oh yeah, that's, So we've got to do it differently. So I would encourage you to look at that. And the framework I'm developing is a 7 elements framework with guidelines and cheat sheets and stuff like that. And then finally, I have just to say that tomorrow, Greener Henley which is, funnily enough, by coincidence, the chaps that have developed the National Emergency Briefing are Nick and Simon Aldrich. Their sister is Kate, who runs Greener Henley, and she's doing a meeting tomorrow, which I'm facilitating, for people that want to host an emergency briefing, but they want it to be an invite-only event as opposed to a public event. So if you, for example, in Greener Henley, they've decided they're just going to have 60 business leaders, some faith leaders, some political people, rather than invite the general public. And so they're hosting a session tomorrow, and Ben Long from National Emergency Briefing is coming along to open it. Kate will then talk through her model and their ideas, and it's freely available. It's free to share. So we've got about 30 people signed up. So there's that one. And then my question for Nick, and you probably won't be able to answer it in 3 minutes. Is one of the things that often holds people back, funnily enough, is information, although we know psychology is behind it all. We know that psychology is the resistance, it's not the information. However, part of it is also for people not making sense of it, making meaning of this at local level. My model does include a meaning making element. But for example, in my village, people don't see flooding here because we happen to live in a place that doesn't get flooded, for example. Um, and they look at other villages and go, well, it's their problem. So even if at local level. So what resources have you found that help people to actually do a risk assessment of where they live? Because that seems to be really thin on the ground. Because I think if people can identify the local risks, they can make more sense of it and say, okay, we need to adapt to this or that. What are your thoughts on that, Nick?
That's a great question, Linda. And it was what I was going to briefly try and respond. I think it was Sue who was asking about adaptation, because for me, that adaptation is a very localized thing. So it's partly about, do you live near a river, or do you live near a sort of a potential heathland that might have a wildfire, or something like that. So there's aspects that are to do with the local geography, but there's also aspects that are to do with the vulnerabilities in the population, because it's normally those people who don't have the resources, either because they haven't got the finances or because they just don't have the capacity to respond, basically. So either very young or very elderly people will be impacted much more by climate change than people who are sort of in the middle years. There's going to be a set of different toolkits and resources out there that you could look at. One of the ones that I've involved with was something called the Local Climate Adaptation Toolkit, or LCAT, which Peter Lafort out of Exeter University, who's got a community of practice, which in fact was the meeting I was at before, where Ben Long came along, and so there's a bit of an alignment going on here. But there is a set of toolkits out there, and quite often coming from a sort of NHS perspective, because I think they end up having to actually sort of deal with the human impacts of a lot of this. So I think there was one that was from the West Midlands, but I think other NHS trusts have also had to sort of think about adaptation and response. Public health parts of local government are also thinking about it. You've obviously got the Environment Agency and quite a lot of work they've been doing there about especially around flooding, coastal erosion as well. But yeah, part of this is knowing where to start, and that's partly about knowing your community, both the sort of the geography of the community and the sort of the human geography in terms of population and risks. But the Local Resilience Forum should have a local risk that's cascaded down from the national risk assessment. At the moment, that doesn't feel very sort of climate-ish. it's kind of thinking about terrorist incidents or other things, rather than the details that you'd want at a very local community level. But yeah, there are resources out there, and I think probably to whether Graham, in your sort of resource hub knowledge thing, is a good place to start to collect and share some of those. But I think that's a task that we probably all need to sort of get aware of what you can use in that space.
Yeah, but it does
Really
immediately
helpful. Thank you, Nick.
presents a new page that we can put into the knowledge base. So yes, thank you. Does anyone else wish to raise any points, please? I am in great delight able to tell you what is coming up in 2 weeks' time. So all praise to Linda, who's going to give us another one of her insights into how best to absorb all this information that we're getting. So look forward very much, Linda, to getting people to come and see you on the 18th of March, which looks like it's a shock and news to you. Well, take that one offline.
Yeah, that's fine. No, I can do that. That's no
Okay.
problem.
Do you want to know what the title is?
Yes, please.
Yeah, you'll be delighted to know, on the subject of taking time to think.
Oh, yes, yes, yes. The thinking environment. Lovely.
Yeah.
That was
Okay.
referred to just the other day, actually, by big Larger Us, which is an incredible organisation that does climate conversations training, and they said that they'd use the the time to think approach, which is good, considering that's what I've spent 20 years working on. Okay.
Good.
Great.
Well, thank you all, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Nick, in particular, for a very
Fantastic, Nick. Thank you.
thought-provoking session. I'm sure you've raised more questions than you answered, which is usually the way. So,
Exactly.
thank you all. Have a great Wednesday afternoon, and we'll see you later. Take care.
Thank
Brilliant. Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.